Welcome to the Public Voice Salon. We are an open dialogue on culture and ideas with a particular focus on education, the arts, and social change. Now, I say education is something we talk about because I have a background in teaching for 25 years, and I've often thought that our profession of education is not represented very well on television, okay? So that's a big motivation behind our TV show. And so with that being said, I'm so excited to welcome today one of my heroes, Deborah Meier, who is actually one of the leaders of the small school movement in New York. She was doing her thing when I was just getting started in teaching in New York City. I taught at a small school called Cascades, and also City as School, which was down in the village. All right, I was learning all this.
Who was the principal when you were at City as School?
Bob Lebetsky was there. Do you remember Bob Lebetsky? Yeah, wonderful, wonderful man. And so basically, in this time of pandemic, what we're calling the big pause, the great pause, when we have a lot of time to think through our society and the structures, and as we emerge from this, what needs to be different? I really think education has to get a very high priority. We think so. And we're going to begin this dialogue with Deborah, and we want this to go further in terms of what is the purpose of education. We don't believe that America has ever had a national conversation as far as what schools are for. And we think that we want people talking about this not only in schools, but in the larger society. We want politicians to be a part of this debate and dialogue. So we're going to start with Deborah and ask you, what are schools for, Deborah? What do you think the main criteria of a school should be? What is the function of schooling in 2020 historically? And you have the floor.
To help us become what we would like to be as a society. And of course, that's part of the dilemma, is we don't think about that also. But schools, I went to a elite private school in New York City. Its purpose was clear. It was progressive, therefore we assumed they read John Dewey, things like that. And I think I got a good education there. But it was absolutely clear their purpose was to produce the leaders of tomorrow. And therefore, they would only take kids who had high test scores or whose parents were very rich. And they only kept you if you did well, so that it was good for their reputation. And they wanted to please parents because they were a private school and they had to do that. But the assumption was that there are leaders of America and there are the people who need good leaders so they can make good choices. And even within schools, they're generally less in private schools, but in most public schools, then there is a top class, the first class or the gifted class or whatever name is given it. And that's for the leaders. In a school that is heterogeneous, you still have to know who are the leaders. And they have to be educated separately. And I went back to my old school some years ago and talked to the staff, and I told them I got a wonderful education there and so forth, but I still don't understand why. I can see why they need people with money to go to the school because of money. But I wasn't clear why they had to give an exam. Why isn't a dumb, rich person just as important as a smart, good person? In fact, maybe more important, because otherwise we're going to elect someday a dumb person as our leader.
Hopefully that will never happen.
Well, no. It's always a possibility if even elite schools don't realize that rich people may have an influence even if they're not smart and capable of good judgment. So I think I could boil it down in many different ways, but the simplest for me is that it's to help every single citizen of this country and those aspiring to be citizens of this country to be able to exercise good judgment on behalf of not only their own interests, but the commonweal as a whole.
Wow.
And,
do you think
that means that the school needs to be a commonweal of a sort of its own, And every member of that school needs to be thinking about what is not just best for me, and my parents have to be thinking not just about what's best for their daughter, but also what's best for all the children in the school, and ideally, if it's a public system, all the children that have a right to go to that school.
Mm-hmm. You wrote this book, Deborah, in 1997, The Power of Their Ideas. I'm going to hold it up for the whole world to see this, The Power of Their Ideas. I read this when I was a graduate student at NYU in the mid-1990s, okay? Powerful book, life-changing book for me. The basic premise of that book is that, you have your own copy, okay?
Copy, and it has me in the front.
You okay?
My hair is not white.
Yes. And
I like to go back to these pictures occasionally to remember that I was once young.
you look lovely. You are wonderful, and you are our hero and our queen. And you were at that time the queen, really, of education in New York. You were the hot ticket at any educational debate. Okay, Deborah Meier as a speaker.
In a way, and I got fooled by it. And they finally pushed me out and destroyed most of the schools that I loved most. Isn't it amazing how fast they can do that?
Well,
I was very lucky to have had some good political allies and to get a MacArthur at a crucial moment. And and I had a wonderful ally in Steve Phillips, who was, did you know Steve Phillips?
I don't know. I didn't know Steve Phillips. No. Oh, I know you're very friendly with Pedro Noguera, who is another person we want to get on our show. Yeah.
Anyway, so but at some point when some foundation decided to give us $50 million, you'd think that's a lot, but
wow,
we don't teach math very well. Any number of zeros seems big to me. So $50 million, I thought was a lot of money. And they offered me and my friends $50 million if we would start a zone for 50,000 students who more or less represented New York City's population, and in small schools that design and alternate forms of accountability in which parents, students, and teachers and the community played a role in exercising their judgment about the school. And we were very thrilled. We got this money and we were ready to start when a new chancellor came in and he said, "I'm not doing it." And I thought, well, maybe they won't offer you the $50 million. Now, first of all, the foundation involved didn't threaten to pull the money. And second of all, I think even if they had threatened it, power was more important to him than $15 million. So I misunderstood how big money was, to think that I could change the world on $50 billion. And that's when I went to Boston.
That's when you left New York, and okay.
As soon as I left New York, they first killed the high school. They didn't kill all of the small schools we started.
Well, let's back up for 1 second, Deborah. Let's just, Deborah, if I may, let's give our viewers a chance to figure out, to digest all this, because you created a school called Central Park East. And anybody who's not an educational wonk is not going to know what that was, or what. Well, we wish that all citizens had this knowledge. That's why our television show, we're hoping to become a more popular show. More people should know what you did. You created a school at a time when the high schools in New York City were so decrepit. The big high schools, the urban schools, they were full of crime and nobody learned anything there.
They weren't as bad as they were made out to be.
Okay.
They were the same as they'd always been.
Yeah.
And it was never a good old days in education.
But what did you do? What was your innovation when you came in with the small schools movement, and how did that differ from
some small, especially high schools in New York already, as you mentioned, and but they were thought of as places for the kids who couldn't make it in the regular schools. Idiosyncratic kids. I mean, something was different about them schools were fine for most kids, but there were these oddballs. And they were very wonderful, some wonderful places that are still around, including City as a School. But what a man named Tony Alvarado, who was the superintendent of District 4, which is East Harlem, part of Central Harlem and mostly East Harlem, he had this idea. He was about 27 years old, or I don't know, he was very young. He became a superintendent suddenly, and he wanted to shake up things. So he wanted to start some new schools that did things differently. And he, through a friend of mine, he had heard my name, and he had a friend who was a friend of mine, and he said, come to East Harlem and start a school. I was then a kindergarten teacher in Central Harlem. And I said, yes. I really didn't believe him, but I thought, let's try it. He promised me I could do whatever I wanted. That he looked in my history, and what I wanted was probably the right thing to do, and he wasn't going to second guess it. And so in 1974, a few of my friends and I started a school of under 100 children. The idea was we'd grow to 200 in East Harlem on 103rd Street. And we sort of let out the word to Head Start centers and so forth that we were opening. And we knew a few people who told their friends. And so, on opening day, maybe we had 50 students. And the next week we had 56. And most of the parents who came to us came because they heard we were not like the other schools, and their kids were having a hard time with the other schools, or they had older siblings who had had a hard time. So they were parents who came to us thinking we would not be like regular schools. At the same time, they aspired to have their children go to a school that was like regular schools. So they had that ambivalence. And one family, when the older girl started doing well in school, they took her out and sent her to a real school. And her brother, who didn't get better or something, he stayed with us for many, many, many years after. But parents began to have a loyalty to the school, and they told their friends, and their friends told their friends, and too many people applied. It was done by, at that time, in a sort of first come, first served. It was handled by the district, and we insisted parents come and visit the school just so that they wouldn't be fooled into, we'd occasionally get a principal who'd call me and say, I have a perfect kid for your school. Now, I knew immediately what he meant. And I said, if he's perfect for my school, why isn't he perfect for yours?
Right.
Well, he needs fewer students in the class, he needs a larger room, he needs more. And I said, so maybe you could do that in your school. And I said, anyway, we don't take kids on the basis of principles. If parents are interested, they apply, and it's done by a lottery or first come, first served. So we started a second school because there was, and then that school got very long waiting list, so we started a third school. And I thought first, second, third, and we would double that and have 6 and 12 and 1 million, and we'd take over the world. But actually, the idea caught on, and a lot of other people wanted to start small schools, and they wanted to start them. They were largely led by teachers who wanted a school, who thought what was wrong with the place they were was not something they could change unless they had colleagues who would work with them together. And so it was both a small school and a certain kind of teacher-led incentive. But as one of the things we discovered is that if it's a small school and people know each other and teachers have power, parents get the idea that they should too. So I would say in the end, what we pioneered was schools that where decisions were made by the people most personally affected by the school, and that is the students, teachers, parents, and immediate community. And I don't mean just teachers, the staff, the school secretary and the lunchroom people, that we were all here in one capacity or other for the same group of children. And their parents were there for us, and we were there for them. And I think it's that I hope is what caught on. It turns out it wasn't entirely. When Bloomberg became mayor many years later, he thought small schools was just you take a big building and you say you're school A, you're school B, you're school C, and now you have small schools. And size was a necessary but insufficient aspect of it. That could run a more rigid school if it was small, because you could really see, in a great big high school, who knows what's going on behind most doors. The principal certainly hasn't got time to run around and find out what the teachers are doing, which is one of the nice things about a big school. In a small school, in the average day, a principal can come into every room and make notes and say, you should start off this way, or you're using the wrong book. So you can have a more rigid and more top-down dictatorship in the small school. So the purpose is not just smallness, but it makes democracy easier. And some people think that democracy shouldn't be easy, but I say the easier it is, the more likely we are to sustain it. And when we make it terribly complicated, we lose people along the way. And we certainly have made it complicated. And that was part of the purpose. I was an American history major. Some of you may know that the founding fathers tried to make it as complicated as they could so that most people wouldn't think that they might be part of the ruling class. And they succeeded. So, but what was fascinating, and what I think is the key to it, is that we kept changing our definition of democracy in a way. Not the definition, we kept seeing different trade-offs. And the kids would sometimes see a trade-off that we hadn't noticed. That if we did this instead of that, things felt different. And then we would talk about it and we'd realize it's because we had cut back on the informal time that kids had for themselves. I mean, we would discover things in the process that some of our wonderful ideas worked for some of us and not for all of us. And sometimes we had to make compromises. It works for most of us, and a few of us, if we tweak a little, we can make it almost work for everybody. And that exploration of democracy, that building, playing with the idea on a human scale, helped me see the world differently. I was a socialist when I started the school, but I think I'm a more realistic socialist because of the school. I understand more about how grandiose the idea is, how grandiose the idea of democracy is. And while I don't think we have one right now, I think it's an oligarchy with democratic features. I'm willing to fight very hard to keep those democratic features because they'll make it easier for us to move the next step. And that's, I think, part of what I learned with kids. You don't start off saying, I want them to be. You start off with them thinking about what's the next step. And then they begin to help shape it, and you begin to see more about what the possibilities are, because you're not, you've got your long-term goal somewhere in your mind, but it's not dominating your every action. And so I'm very pleased that the Democratic Socialists of America has now got 50,000 members, and when I helped start it, it had 50 maybe. They all stayed at my house when they came through Chicago.
You have so many important things to say. You should be on all the big shows. Rachel Maddow should have you on tonight, then Lawrence O'Donnell should have you the next day. You have so much to say. And we want to remind the world right now that America has a crisis in democracy with Donald Trump as the president. And had people been paying attention to people like Deborah Meier over the past 30 years, I don't think Trump would be in the White House. You would have a citizenry who could think. Look at Deborah's book, The Power of Their Ideas.
The publisher wanted to call it The Power of Our Ideas.
Okay.
And I said, no, that's not the point of what I discovered. I discovered the power of their ideas, the kids and parents. And that democracy rests on a kind of respect for, a kind of human respect for each other, mutual love of a sort and respect. Love is not enough and respect may not be enough, but the right combination. And I think that was true of most of those small schools in New York before they became replicated citywide.
Well, Paulo Freire.
What's missing in democracy is mutual respect.
Yes. Paulo Freire said, and Paulo Freire was a great Brazilian educator whose work I am very familiar with because I read The Pedagogy of the Oppressed when I was in graduate school at NYU, okay? And when I went out to try to change the world as a liberating educator, armed with these ideas, having read my John Dewey, having read my Deborah Meier, okay? And I would go into schools and they would tell me, forget about everything you learned at NYU. This is how the real world is. And you know what? I had to teach under the radar. That was the title of my first book on education, Teaching Under the Radar, Confessions of a Secret Agent of Change, okay? I want the teachers...
Sorry, write that, is it still in publication somewhere?
No, I couldn't get a publisher like you did. I'm not very good at marketing myself. I'm very bad. So hopefully, I've written 15 books. They're all self-published, I do consider myself an intellectual and a thinker, but I haven't gotten the publishing industrial complex on board with my agenda yet. However, I really think this is very important for America to have this dialogue, and we want to increase our viewership. We want people talking in the streets about this. What is the purpose of schooling? Is it just to get a good job? It seems like that's what it's been reduced to over the past 30 years, that education has all about job training.
You have to get a bad job, not to be complacent about it, not to make trouble in a bad job.
But what do you think is the purpose of schooling, Deborah? We want to really wrestle with this question. As we're losing our democracy, okay, we're losing it now. If Trump gets in again, it's over. I think it's over. So we're this close to losing our democracy. Now, and at the same time, they've been marginalizing people like you and Diane Ravitch, who can't get on the big shows either. You know what I'm saying? I think we need to create our own big network. We need to create our own. We need a billionaire right now to say, look, we want this on prime time, not just on Zoom or on YouTube. This has to be on 9 o'clock. Deborah Meier, Diane Ravitch, having these great thinkers and leaders and people who have something to say, right?
We need to look at more films also about what we mean, what such a classroom looks like, because a lot of people think that what I'm talking about is do your own thing.
Yeah.
There are no rules. Every child comes in the room and does whatever they feel like that day. And which isn't a terrible idea.
Sometimes it's fun.
Especially if you only have 10 of them. And the room is very large. But I think you're right. But I don't want us to have illusions about what the past was. This is a fairly recent idea that everybody can be a member of the ruling class. It's not an idea that has ever been in power. It's not ever been operational, but as an idea, it is a fairly recent one. And when I was born, which children in the school thought it was more or less the same time Plato was born, but when I was born, most children didn't start high school, much less drop out. It's important to remember that. high school was not meant for most kids. And most kids lots of kids who did many of them did well economically, left school in 7th and 8th or 6th and 7th grade. Some of them spent 7 years and never got beyond 3rd grade. We have a false picture of what the past was like. And there's a book by Richard Rothstein called The Way Things Were. It's a small book. It's full of humor. It's a wonderful book to read over and over again to remind yourself that we're trying something that has never been tried before.
Now, what do you think about E.D. Hirsch has a new book out called How to Educate a Citizen. How to Educate a Citizen. Now, I know Hirsch has been controversial in the past, but I think...
Well, and I think Diane Ravitch and I used to disagree.
Okay.
She was sort of pro-Hirsch at one time.
Yes.
And she's still a little bit more on that side than mine. She's more interested than I am in the details of curriculum, what needs to be covered. But I think part of it is that he doesn't understand what the incredible strength of human beings are that makes democracy feasible. That we are learners from the moment we come out of the mother's womb. And everything we learn because we're interested. We're hungry for it. We try it out. It works or it doesn't work, and tend to try out the one that worked more often than the one that didn't work, and so forth and so on. That's how we learned our language. That's how we learn to read. That's how we learn everything. So the question is to make the world that surrounds children such an interesting place that they are learning all the time. And they're expanding their range of their learning. And to do that, you also need a mixture of ages. Was City as the School mixed ages? I don't.
Yeah, just to let people know, I actually did my student teaching at City as School, which is in the Village, which was at the time and still is a very famous progressive alternative high school that took students who didn't fit into other programs, but you also had middle class kids who were wealthy who wanted that. You had Jean-Michel Basquiat, who became a very famous painter, African-American painter, celebrity. He went to City as School because they gave you creativity. They gave you freedom to really think and be a person and go for your dreams in a way.
They treated you like a newborn human being who was entering into a fascinating world that they wanted to figure out. And they were surrounded by some kids who were already figured out things they hadn't, so they could learn from them. Many teachers, potentially. And the teachers they had were other interesting adults, people they might aspire at times to be. That it was intergenerational communities, and which is, of course, also why children learn. If they were put into a community all of 2-month-olds, and we kept them then in a room full of 3-month-olds and a room full of 4-month-olds, they would never learn to talk.
Can I tell you my favorite Bob Lebetsky story? My favorite? All right, Bob Lebetsky was the principal of City as School when I was teaching there, when I was doing my student teaching in 1997. And it was the first day of class, and he gave a lecture to the new students coming in, and a lot of these kids were tough. They had the baseball caps, and it was like, and he was speaking in front of these kids, and I'm thinking, gee, how is this going to go? Because he's so gentle and kind, but also there's a firmness there, and he had these students like they were paying attention to him, and because they knew that this was a place for them. This was a place of heart, of caring. They were not going to disrupt it because this was a good place. So at the end of his speech, welcome speech, he said this. He said, "My door is always open to you. My principal's office door is always open to you if ever you want to come by, even if you just want to say hello, because I get lonely too." He said, I never saw a male role model, an authority figure, be so vulnerable in my entire life. And that was the exact opposite of other high schools and schools where I taught, where the principal was like a Trumpian type, this is how it's going to be because I say so, And he was the complete opposite, And it worked, because if you're a human being, if you're honest, and I was always like that. Every school where I taught as a substitute teacher, Deborah, I would go in inner city schools in Hoboken, which is where we live. These were tough schools, and they said to me, the administration said, "You're the only substitute who comes back. What are you doing?" And I would just be nice, and I would listen to the students, and I would build community.
I want to challenge this word tough.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
They're partly tough because, thank God, they're tough.
Yeah, yes.
When I would explain to parents about we didn't allow fighting in school, and they said, "Well, how could they survive in the community if they didn't fight?" And I said, "Well, actually, there are ways we could." You asked me the question. There are other answers to it, but in the meantime, let's not fight where we don't have to. And in this school, if we have to fight to protect ourselves, that's all of our community problem. And I would sell parents on that. I said, there are things you don't allow in your own home because you're there to help. But when your children are out in the street, you're not there to help. They have to figure out their own strategies. And I tell you, despite all the things I would hear about tough New York City schools, I was amazed. And I subbed also in Chicago. I subbed at all the South Side schools for 2 years, every day in a different school, if I could, because I usually did such a terrible job the day I was there. I wouldn't want to go back. And I learned a lot. And one of them, though, was that the kids they're not so tough. I was more afraid of them because I still saw them, even with my involvement in the civil rights movement, this and that other thing. I still saw them as a them.
Yes.
And
wow.
So I know I'm not criticizing your use of the word tough, but there's a way we use it as though all human beings aren't tough. What we have to do is look at them with respect for their toughness.
Yeah.
If we think about how we talk about their families and their community and each other, why should they trust us? And so to earn their trust and respect, sometimes someone is like Lubetzky, maybe has some kind of charisma.
Oh yeah.
But a lot of us don't have that, and it takes us a little longer. And keep reminding us, it took these kids many years to learn to distrust people like me. And they were right.
Yes, yes.
Be patient as they learn to trust some of us.
Wow. Deborah, there were 2 books that I read by Herb Cole. I want to mention Herb Cole. 2 essential books by Herb Cole. One was called The Discipline of Hope. This came out at the same time when I was beginning my career as an educator. Herb Cole, again, is one of the great educational thinkers in our planet. Okay.
I've never read that book, though.
He wrote a book called Discipline of Hope, where he said that one of the most important things we can teach young people today is simply to be more hopeful because of the way the world is. Okay, if we were to save our planet, if we're going to make a better world, they have to have a sense of hope. That was
a recent book.
No, this came out 20 years ago when I was beginning my career as an educator.
The book 36 Children.
That was a classic of his.
I think that was his first book.
Yes, that came out in the 70s. Another one of his books that came out around the time when I was beginning my career was called I Won't Learn From You. I Won't Learn From You. And it's exactly what you just said. It's when you're a white teacher and you're in the inner city and you're working with students of color, they have distrusted people like you for a reason. So you have to win them over in a way and show them, that you're different, that you're on their side.
And they would like there to be one. They would like you to win them over. You have, generally speaking, I find you have something going for you. They would also like to have a more interesting school. And it's also the way we treat parents. Now, you may not notice that as much in high schools, but I was stunned by how teachers of young children, how disrespectfully they talked to parents. I had young children at the time I started teaching, And I discovered, in fact, they weren't very respectful of me. In other words, it's not just because there was a class race difference, but I think it's partly because teachers are not themselves respected, that they that they feel they have to make up for that by disrespecting somebody else. So it's, they would like someone to be lower in the scale than they are. And
do you think teachers are not respected? Yeah. What can we do in our society to respect teachers more? What could be done? What needs to be done?
Decision makers. If teachers were not treated as though they don't have a capacity to make judgments, then, and that's all, they have to make judgments every second of the day, but we treat them as though they, ideally, they never have to make judgments. Then, the head of the early childhood department at Temple University, when I lived in Philadelphia for a year, he called me into his office because I was getting a certificate in Pennsylvania. And he said, sort of angrily at me, I just was looking over your resume and what are you doing? And being a pre-cook, I was a Head Start teacher there. What were you doing being a Head Start teacher? Why did we educate women like you? And then you end up deciding to teach little children. And I said, wait a minute, are you the head of the early childhood elementary school division? He said, yes. And there are people, we need people to do that, but we don't need people with your education. You don't need a master's degree and a PhD to teach little children. And that was, my parents even had the same attitude. Why did their smart daughter end up teaching?
What did they want you to do? What would they have preferred you to do, Deborah?
Be a college professor.
Okay.
They might even have felt a little less uncomfortable if I had been a high school history teacher. Or, got a job at a do-good organization. My mother wanted me to have paid work. She had been a volunteer all her life, and she was a sort of precursor to the women's movement. She thought women should start demanding jobs that paid.
Yes.
And so it's one of the reasons I started subbing. I had 3 young children, and I was active in the civil rights movement and the peace movement and the socialist movement, but I thought I should be earning my way. And I happened to find it the most intellectually and emotionally satisfying work that I could imagine.
Deborah, how did your work in the socialist movement and your political activities outside of school, how did that impact your thinking about education? I'd like to go more into detail.
In Chicago, I knew a lot of young Black people and parents and so forth. So I lived in on 50th Street in the South Side, and the neighborhood was, there was rich Black people who lived in that neighborhood and poor Black people. There was no Latino community in Chicago at that time. But so my kids played with them. We were in the playground. So partially, just getting to know each other. And the other part was that I found the world fascinating. And all of those fascinations fed into the work because the kids were interested in my life. I was interested in their life. And
so it's like a dialogue, really. It's like a conversation that you're having with the students. And are you still friends with some of your students over?
Well, they were in Chicago, but there is one who's a reporter now. Davis was his first name. Anyway, who I occasionally hear from. But the kids are from New York, from the Central Park East schools. We have a lot of keep in touch. And in fact, we're trying to make a movie interviewing the kids who graduated high school in the early 90s, in their 40s, about what the school meant to them and how it's influenced their lives.
Wow.
And one of the themes that's coming up right away is they felt they belonged to an interesting community. They felt they were special.
Yes.
And, every family can be special. Every school can be special. They can be if people feel this is my place. I helped build this.
Wow.
I'm accepted here.
Wow.
And those kids have stayed in touch with a lot of the faculty.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And that's one of the things hard in big cities is that you don't, since the schools tend to be less neighborhood based, you don't necessarily get to see what happens to your students. And you saw them in kindergarten and then, they disappear. And since lots of elementary schools in New York and Chicago had more than 1,000 students in it, much more, some of them, and high schools, 4,000 and 5,000. The notion that you belong to it.
Yes.
You can still feel if the school has a lot of prestige, I suppose you can feel some pride in belonging to it because it's a top school. But it's a pride that you haven't earned, and which you don't deserve.
Deborah, I'm going to tell you a story, okay? I want to tell you a story about my relationship with your ideas, from the power of their ideas. This book that you wrote, which I read years ago when I was starting my career, and there was something you wrote that leapt off the page for me about how important it was that America once had these public square cultures, these places like unions where working people could find their public voice, and we're losing all that. Well, at the time, I was joining a club in Hoboken, New Jersey, where I still live, called the Elks Club. Now, Elks is like a nationwide organization. It's a charity organization, and it tends to be a little more conservative, but whatever. I became an officer and was beginning to find my voice in this club at the time when I read your words, and I said, I know exactly what she's talking about. This wasn't a union, but we were doing these public things, like we were having fundraisers, and should we order, cans of soda or bottles of soda, all these like sort of mundane things, but for a cause, and using the public voice in a public, but feeling like you're part of a community, right? So then from there, I would go into Harlem, where I was teaching at Park East, which I like to say was the evil twin of Central Park East. You had the angelic...
No, it was the good twin once.
Well, it was once. When Stanley Arana was founded in 1973, it was, but I got there 20 years later when it had fallen apart, and it was in really rough shape. And so I was teaching there. But when I would walk into the school, the students would be hanging out in front, and I would say hi to them, because I had a feeling of belonging in a community from this Elks Club. Once I joined the Elks Club in Hoboken, I began to see people on the street who I knew, neighbors and politicians. Hey, how you doing? Good to see you. It was this sense of connection.
You've never experienced that.
Most people don't even know what that is. It's like an alien quality. So I've since gotten that from other organizations as well, including churches. I go to Judson Church in the Village, which is has a strong sense of community and is known for social justice and the arts, okay? And also I joined a club called the Village Independent Democrats, which I belong to, and just feeling part of a progressive community of care, that there are people here. And I think there's something about that you learn from those organizations, you learn how to find your voice, and that became my professional development, Deborah, because and still when I teach, I learned how to be in a community by being in communities. Teachers now don't know what it is to be in a community. They have because they're not in communities. And
what you're reminding me of is it's not even that everybody in the community, it has to agree with each other. And in fact, the problem with many political communities is they get very sectarian. They begin to argue not in order to build the organization, but to prove they're right. And I realized at some point that it isn't true that democracy requires compromise. Life requires compromise. And if democracy is going to be part of life, of course, compromise just means you've heard the other person and you're trying to figure out how could we still do this together.
One thing is hard to do that when you have an educational regime that's so predicated on standardized testing and the right answer. So there is no room for play. There's no room for nuance, okay? As an educator, my discipline is English, literature. So I think the best thing to do is just talk about a text and turn the classroom into a book club. And what do you think the character should do now? And did they make the right choice? And so the classroom becomes a laboratory of democracy, rich with dialogue and storytelling.
Sometimes you find that another reader likes a different character than you do. You're identifying with this person, and it never occurred to you anybody would see that person as the hero of the story.
Deborah, do you know about...
You definitely have to change the way you read this. Not because you're compromising your standards, but because
Correct.
Expanding.
Correct. I want the people watching us right now to know that Deborah Meier and I are not, this is not an interview. This is a dialogue. This is two colleagues who are educators, and we want the world to know what that is too, because we're so used to watching these breaking news shows where one person is interviewing the other person, and it's sound bites, and and it's that. This is just two colleagues having a dialogue about education and why it matters, and in particular trying to always circle back to what is the purpose of education in 2020, and how can we get into a situation where education is for democracy. That's really what we want to go back to. John Dewey, his first book in 1916 was Education and Democracy, okay? He created the laboratory school in Chicago where Obama's daughters went to, okay? He came to Teachers College, which, by the way, Teachers College gave you an honorary doctorate degree, okay? I want people to know before we're out of time the wonderful things that our guest has done and earned. She has gotten honorary degrees from Dartmouth University, Teachers College, Columbia, Yale, Brown, Bank Street, okay?
Harvard.
Harvard. Oh my goodness. Okay. Wait a minute. She was the first person to win a MacArthur grant. The very first teacher, she was the first educator to win a MacArthur Fellowship. That's saying a lot. In 1987, she did that. So, I mean...
I didn't do that. They did it.
Well...
I didn't do anything to win that. I didn't even know I was being nominated until some man named Mr. Hope called me up and said, anyway.
Who was that? But wasn't Bob Hope? Was it Bob Hope?
No, he was the executive. I'm at a staff meeting and someone comes in and says, there's a phone call for you. And I said, well, we're at a meeting right now, so tell them I'll call them afterwards. The person comes back and she said, Debbie, they said you have to. Anyway, this goes back and forth, and finally I go upstairs and I get on the phone and I said, Mr. Hope, I hope this is important. There's a lot of us in the room here in Chicago, and we are calling you and we're all looking at you. No, they're not looking at you. Right. We want you to know that you have won the Macarthur Award.
Oh.
And I said, listen, this is probably a joke, I said, so please make this short because I have a meeting going on. And in any case, he said, well, don't tell anybody about this right away because we like to tell the newspapers first after we've told you. And it'll be in the press on Monday morning or something like that. And of course, I went right downstairs and said to the staff, this may be a joke, but... And then as we were driving to the country with some of my friends that weekend, I said, listen, whoever was driving, drive carefully because I'm gathered that you don't get this money after you're dead.
Oh, gee, yes.
It wasn't a part of your inheritance.
My goodness.
So let's wait till we get all the money.
Yes. Well, we do need some money.
Listen, I just wanted to read one little thing from that book you like. It won't come as a surprise that I think the conditions that foster good teaching are the conditions I've described already: small schools, schools of choice, school autonomy over the critical dimensions of teaching and learning, lots of time for building relationships and reflecting on what's happening, along with a culture of mutual respect for others and a set of habits of mind that fosters inquiry as well as responsibility. What makes me hopeful, point, no matter what bad news tomorrow brings, I want you to think about this in November,
Okay.
is our infinite capacity for inventing the future, imagining things otherwise. What allows me to remain optimistic, even though there's presently more racism and meanness in my hometown and the nation than I ever recall witnessing before. So this was written 20 years ago.
Wonderful. You know, when you said that word otherwise, I could not but think of my dear friend Maxine Green, who had a famous quote. She said that imagination is the capacity to think of things as if they could be otherwise. So I think we all need to be able to, at a time like this, when we have COVID, when we have an authoritarian in the White House, when we have racism, we have all these problems, we have to be able to have the imagination to think of a better world. So you're keeping that spirit alive. We want you to come back on the show, keep this dialogue going. How is your pond? I heard that you have a lovely pond on your property. It's very famous.
You come up here and you'll love it. You'll see that it's the world's greatest pond.
We might have to.
Better than Walden.
Better than Walden from Thoreau. Claudia, how much time? We have 5 minutes left. Gosh, I realized like the time went so fast. This was like, I'm like a kid in a candy store with Deborah Meier, because you're just like one of my heroes, and we're so glad that we got to begin this dialogue with you. I think we should send this over to Jill Biden. I really want to bring Jill Biden into this conversation, because here we have the wife of Joe Biden with a PhD in education. I don't think we've ever had a doctorate in education so close to the White House, to power like that. And so I would love to know what Jill thinks about these things, and to really keep this going. But as we wind it up, let's go back to the theme. What is the purpose of education? Why don't you just sort of talk us out on that?
Sending my child to a school for shoemakers, I would expect that there would be some people in that school who are good at shoemaking and some who are learning it, and then I would see a lot of kids playing around with shoes. So if democracy is worth anything, and I still think it's very hard to define, but when it's got something to do with that, we, the people, all of us, are members of the ruling class and need a ruling class education. If we believe that, certainly going into a contemporary school wouldn't give you any hint that that's what's supposed to be going on there, is learning how to be a citizen of a democracy. There isn't any hint. I mean, at the most sophisticated idea about what democracy is in a kindergarten class when they're voting on what color to call them, the people who want it to be a blue flag or a green flag. And majority wins, and that's supposed to prepare you for democracy. That's the closest thing that we do that's democratic in a school. But underneath that, I had never been, until I started substitute teaching in Chicago, in an environment that was as disrespectful, not only to children and parents, but to its own working staff, its teachers. I just hadn't been. People would say, well, they treat you like a child. And I said, well, I wasn't treated that way as a child. This is training to how to be subservient and sabotage, because the only thing left that you have to do in a dictatorship is to learn how to be a good saboteur. Close your door and figure out how you can get your message across. So let's hope we get lots of places where we can talk about.
And if Joe Biden turns to you and offers you the Secretary of Education, what's going to be?
Let me think.
Well, maybe-
The only problem was that I probably couldn't walk up the stairs.
Well, you could do it by Zoom. You could do the whole thing by Zoom. I mean, you'll do a heck of a lot better than what we got now.
Well,
Hopefully, everything will change in November, but we have got to stay strong, and we are so delighted.
we did in November. We got we have to have twice as much strength to make sure that what we've won is something we can hold on to, sustain, and grow.
And make sure this doesn't happen again. And we have a lot of work to do. We're so delighted to be in a dialogue with Deborah Meier. Deborah would love
Claudia, where's Claudia?
Claudia's here. Say hello, Claudia. Claudia's right here. My darling wife, Claudia. Without Claudia, without her love and support, this wouldn't exist. Okay, so Claudia.
Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay, we'll talk soon. Thank you again so much, Deborah. Be well. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll talk. Okay.